language. But then, even that doesn't solve all the mysteries. I mean, what is it about this wish to convey a language which is seen? What's that all about? Is it that perhaps language has always been a gift from the other? It's a little hard to picture how the kind of language I'm using right now ever got started. Notice that language is a behavior. It's a behavior, that's all it is. It's a complex activity having to do with small mouth noises and the neurological processing of same. We must have been essentially as we are before language. It's like breakdancing or something like that. You're fully set up to do it, and people have been for millennia. But until somebody actually does it, it only exists as a formal possibility in the organism. And I wonder how many of these things there are. Breakdancing is an interesting example, albeit somewhat trivial, but it shows that after 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 years of civilization, you can come up with a behavior that nobody has ever seen before. I've spent a lot of time thinking about language and what a limited tool it is, and yet how our whole world is held together by nothing more than small mouth noises. And it's incredible. The entirety of global civilization is held together by small mouth noises and symbolic notations of same, which have an even more rarefied level of abstraction. Our separateness, our notion of self and world, of self and species, all rest on the carrying capacity of these small mouth noises. One of the things that has interested me, some of you have heard me talk about this, is, I think good psychedelic trips inspire a lot of homework, which usually means reading in curious areas. And I discovered that octopi, cephalopods, which in case you're not up on your evolutionary biology, these are mollusca. They're not even vertebrates. They're related to escargot and banana slugs. You can hardly imagine a form of life more alien to ourselves. We broke off from the other primates 3 million years ago, but the invertebrates and the vertebrates separated from each other about 700 million years ago. Well, an interesting thing going on with octopi, most people have heard that they can change color. And most people, I think, assume this means that, like certain lizards and certain butterflies, they camouflage themselves against their background. That's not what's going on. Color and texture for octopi are the medium of language. You could almost say that an octopus is a naked mind, because as the octopus goes through certain internal changes, hunger, sexual need, whatever, color changes accompany these shifts of internal state and appear on the surface of the octopus. It is almost as though it wears its language like an overcoat. It is clothed in its own meaning. Well, obviously, in that kind of situation, you have always been suspended in an ambiance of language, unlike ourselves, where apparently language was invented one bright summer day, or series of bright summer days. And if you have a language such as we have, small mouth noises with culturally assigned meaning. In other words, if I say, "Where can I get a taxi?" If I don't say this to a person who speaks English, it means nothing to a Ukrainian or a Chinese. Octopi don't have this problem. There are not culturally localized languages. There's only a language of the body, the genes. It's unambiguous. You see, even those of us in this room, if you were to check, our internal dictionaries are different. We have only the assumption of one-to-one mapping of meaning. I mean, if I ask you, where is the restroom, this is fairly unambiguous, because it deals with ordinary situations. But as soon as conversation leaves the main and well-trodden path of discourse, ambiguity enters into a tremendous degree. We overlook this as a courtesy to each other. I mean, you almost never hear one person say to another, "Now, would you explain to me what I just said?" The reason you don't hear this said very often is because the thin illusion of communication would break down completely if we actually demanded of our listeners that they repeat back to us. The only situation in which that happens on a regular basis is the pedagogical mode, where the teacher teaches and then by test and recitation determines that the pupil has understood. But in polite discourse among adults, we consider this an imposition, if not an insult. So somehow these creatures are elves of language, catalysts for the concrescence of cognition. And I don't know if these things can be understood. After all, we're embedded in the world created by our own meanings. C.D. Broad, I think it was C.D. Broad, wrote a book called The Meaning of Meaning. Or no, it was F.H. Bradley, actually. I think Broad's book was called The Mind and Its Place in Nature. Probably these two should be read back to back, just to see how positivists handle these kinds of problems. The meaning of meaning is a real problem, but it also tends to be solipsistic or tautological. Can we expect brain to give a full accounting of brain? Can we expect mind to give a full accounting of mind? Anybody who's studied logic for 10 minutes can tell you that that's impossible because it is tautological.
Harvard philosopher Hilary Putnam, in the mid-'70s, he wrote a paper called The Meaning of Meaning, which is very influential. And I guess the key slogan that came out of that is that meanings just ain't in the head. Agree, disagree, or just is that just incoherent?
It's incoherent without further explanation. First you have to tell us what meanings are. I mean, you can't decide whether they're in the head or not until we know what they are. If by meanings we have in mind what people have in mind when they're using the word in English, then sure, they're not in the head. They're all over the place. Talk about the meaning of life, it's not in the head. If you have some more technical notion in mind, you've got to explain what it is. If the technical, and there it's a matter of choice. You can define the technical notion so that it's in the head or so that it's not in the head. When you define technical notions, you have a choice. The way it's done in the sciences and the way it ought to be done is you define a technical notion in the context of an explanatory theory. You don't just define a technical notion out in space. So let's ask, what's the explanatory theory in which we're going to give a technical notion which will pronounce meaning or pronounce it some other way. And then we'll ask whether that theory is a sensible theory and does it place this technical concept in the head or not. But all that extra work hasn't been done.
Why can't we say there's just a pre-theoretical notion of meaning and what we want to do is try and elucidate or precify it in some way or other?
Yeah, you could do that, but there's a million ways of doing it. So what about the meaning of life, for example? That's part of the pre-theoretical notion.
Is it?
Is it? Sure it is. I mean, people talk about the meaning of what's the meaning of life all the time.
And you think that's the same notion of meaning as when you say what's the meaning of the word?
No, there's it's a huge range of things. What did he mean by saying so-and-so usually has to do with what was his intention, or something like that.
Right.
So part of the pre-theoretical meaning has to do with people's intentions. In fact, when you talk about the meaning of a word, that's a rather English-specific locution. And we could focus on that if we like, but And if you want, you can try to clarify it. But again, to try to clarify a pre-theoretical notion makes sense within the framework of an effort to understand something, to an explanatory account.
Well, suppose we go with the following attempt to clarify, or at least introduction of a piece of technical terminology, which is philosophers will talk about the content of a mental state, or the content of some sort of expression. Is that helpful?
No, because content is a technical notion. It's not being used in the sense of the ordinary concept content.
Right.
And used by now, since Putnam, in fact, and Kripke and others, it's typically used to refer to something out there. So the content of an expression is not in the head by definition, because we've defined it to be not in the head.
Right.
All right, then the question is, well, does that have anything to do with our notions of, does that have anything to do with our understanding of the way language works and is used? Okay, that's the question.
And
you can certainly, I think it has very little to do with it.
well, suppose we thought of it this way. Suppose we thought of the enterprise being sketched in the following way. There are two ways in which you might study primates, for example. You might study primate anatomy, in which case you're just concerned about, bones and muscles and tendons and so forth. And then you might also study primate ecology, in which case you're studying the relation between the primate and its environment. And I take it that what these philosophers are talking about here, when they talk about external content, is that they're saying a part of talk about meaning has to be analyzed in terms of thinking about the organism, the human organism, in relation to its environment, right? So
it has to, if you want to study the relation between the human organism and its environment. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with studying the human organism and its environment. That's what sociologists are doing all the time.
Right.
But you have to do it seriously. If you want to do it seriously, you ask, first of all, let's go back to primates. When you study primates in their ecology, you don't just look at the anatomy of primates. You look at the physiology of primates, what you might call mental processes of primates, the way they seem to be interpreting the world, the perceptual abilities of primates. In fact, what you try to do is exploit to the extent you can what we know about an individual ape. A chimpanzee, so you want to know, what do we understand about that ape? And that information we will bring to bear in the study of how the ape interacts with other apes and with the rest of the environment and so on. That's the way it's done with primates or with ants or anyone else, and I think that's the way it ought to be done with humans. So we should ask, okay, well, what do we understand about the internal nature of the creature that's doing all these things? And to the extent that we understand something about that, we can ask sensible questions about how it interacts with the external world, with other people, and so on and so forth.
do you think that could potentially inform the sort of internalist investigation as well?
Sure, it goes the other way. There's no order. You can study the sociology of ape communities, and that'll could tell you something important about the internal thinking processes of apes, or even their internal anatomy.
And vice versa, presumably.
Yeah, sure. Science goes all ways.
Here's another technical term that's been used, reference. You consider that to be incoherent as well? Or?
Well, until it's explained, it's incoherent. Once it's explained, then it becomes non-incoherent.
Well, you see, one thing I've never quite understood is exactly what the problem is with reference, because, I can say, well, okay, now I'm referring to this coffee cup.
That's different.
That's
quite different.
Okay.
You're talking about an action of referring.
Right.
That's a common sense notion. It's part of English and every language I know of. There's some way to talk about such actions. But what the philosophers have introduced is a different notion, a notion that's supposed to hold between a linguistic entity and something in the world. Now, that's not referring. Referring is an act that people do. Peter
this is the point that goes back to
this out
Strawson,
50
right?
years ago, but it goes way back. And it's just a fact.
Okay, so let's take
this. If you want to make up a technical term which you pronounce the same way, first of all, it's questionable whether you should pronounce it the same way because it's misleading. But if you do, let's at least keep clear that it's a technical term, kind of like physicists use energy. They don't mean it the way we do in ordinary language. They mean it the way they say they mean it. So let's take the technical term refer or denote or whatever you want to call it, and tell us what it's supposed to, tell us what you mean by it, and tell us what explanatory theory it enters into. So when a physicist defines energy, you're not interested in the definition. You're interested in the set of principles and assumptions and so and problems and so on, within which that technical concept is introduced. And then you look and see how good the theory is. Well, here we don't have any theory. And we don't even have an explanation of what the technical notion is. So it's impossible to talk about it.
Yeah, I think it might be a mistake to think of it as a technical notion. I mean, I think it's just a sort of precisified way of describing certain basic core level facts, right?
Right.
So, for example, I might say, well, once you understand that people refer to things and so forth, it's not a hard step to say, well, okay, certain names are canonically used to refer to certain things and certain individuals. So the name Noam Chomsky, I mean, I can ask the audience here, what person in this room does that term refer to?
Well,
and
you
no
could
one's
ask,
gonna have
what do you use that term when you refer to something in the world? That you can ask. But when you ask what the term refers to, you're assuming that there is a relation between terms and things. And then you have to explain what that relation is, because that's a new one. We don't have that in ordinary language. And in fact, I think it's leading us off into a wrong picture, as Wittgenstein would have called it. And it's leading us to a picture of language, which is, we know what it's based on. I mean, it's based on things like Frege's, the theory of arithmetic, and it's just the wrong picture for language, I think.
I'm sure some of you have heard me recall the situation where Wittgenstein was raving about something, and one of his students said, "But is it the truth?" And he said, "Well, it's true enough." And this is really means a great divide has been crossed when you can say that, because it means you understand now that you are no longer a fairy in a Platonic super world, but that you are actually a monkey with a brain full of mush trying to sort out, what's right in front of you. True enough is what we should probably rest with. It's amazing to me. I mean, if you were to meet a termite who stated that his or her goal in life was the perfect modeling of the cosmos, you would think it was quite a comic undertaking. And yet, how different are we that we should presume to more than a shadow of the truth. Well, then, finally, or I don't know finally, but completing my laundry list here, linguistic truth, or the truth of language and the illusions that language weaves, because someone quite intelligent said language was invented so that people could lie. In other words, it gives you that fudge factor of obfuscation where someone says, why did you do that? Well, the best approach is, I didn't do that. You thought I did that. What you thought you saw, you didn't see. In other words, I suppose that lawyers are probably the people who have done the finest work with language, and behind them, politicians. And the true potential for language to elevate and to unite the community was early on betrayed into the production of illusory and ideological goods, which could then be marketed among the people and to spread confusion. Psychedelics reflect on this because psychedelics stretch and pull and melt and recast the illusion-producing machinery of language. I mean, I think that if you had to say the one thing that psychedelics do for everyone, whether they have a good trip or a bad trip, because it's up to them to interpret what they make of this, is it shows you the relativity of your cultural viewpoint. that it's just your point of view. You inherited it from a geographical area, a culture, a set of parents. It has no relationship whatsoever to anything anchored in some kind of metaphysical superspace. It's just your cultural point of view. And travel actually does the same thing. And I've always felt there was a weird affinity between psychedelics and travel, and I suppose many people have, or we wouldn't call it a trip, and we wouldn't call it a journey. But travel shows you the relativity of culture. And what's really happening when you travel, you see, is you're moving from one language domain to another. We don't think of it that way, but that is in fact what is happening. You can never see the Amazon jungle if you keep intact the bubble of linguistic assumptions of the place you started out from. Every place will withhold its secrets from you. I learned this in the Amazon because the first time I went, I had virtually no botany. And to me, the jungle was green. That's what it was. And it was many shades of green, and it was beautiful, and it was this and that, but it was basically green. The second time I went, I was with a lot of botanists. And within days, you learn the families. That's how they do it. With the same taxonomy I'm here applying to illusion was really developed to describe plants and animals. So you learn the families, the plants with square stems, the plants with the opposed leaves, the plants with the particular flower structure. Once you know families, then you have a linguistic wedge in. But the corrupting or curious thing about language is that, like all tools, it shapes its user in ways that are not suspected until it's too late. So, for instance, the way in which Western civilization is totally obsessed with the subject-object relationship, and it's the basis of our science, our polity, our relations to commerce, the concept of product. All of these things come out of the subject-object relationship, which is an aspect of language. So I point all this out because in talking about my new book, somebody said that I had gone too far. And I was amused because it implied, from what? It's not like there is a King's X where graybeards in white coats tend the sacred vestal fires of reality. There is no reality. There are only people who know this and people who don't know this and are therefore being manipulated by the people who do know it. This is true, or true enough.
We have very little information about what thought is. In fact, it's not even very clear how you could have such information. But a lot of the mass of our information about thought is what we get by looking at language. So that yields the suggestion that, say, Humboldt took to an extreme, that they're the same. But again, you can introspect if you like. It's the only kind of evidence we have. It doesn't look as if they're the same. There seems to be lots of kinds of thought that just never can get articulated. And I don't see any reason to doubt that some kind of thought is going on with organisms that don't have language. There is, in computational cognitive science, there's a big enterprise, which in my view is a total waste of time, which goes back to a misreading of a very short paper by Alan Turing Back in 1950, Alan Turing's great mathematician and founder of modern computational science and so on, he had a paper called something like Do Machines Think? And that's led to, and he devised a test. It's now called the Turing test. He called it an imitation game. And there's been a lot of effort to try to, and what he argued is or what he's been interpreted as arguing, he didn't say it, is that if a machine means program, not a physical computer, but a program, if a program can pass this test, that'll show that it thinks. And if you're an employee of IBM, you get paid to construct Watson and other huge programs that are supposed to pass the test. You know, they defeat people in chess or Jeopardy or something. And you can get $100,000 if you pass if you construct such a program. There's one line in Turing's paper which seems to have been ignored. What he said is, the question whether machines think is too meaningless to deserve discussion. Okay, and he's right. The question whether machines think is like asking whether submarines swim, let's say. If you want to call that swimming, yeah, they swim. If you don't want to call it swimming, they don't. But it's not a factual question. It's do humans fly? I think in Japanese they do, somebody told me, but in English they don't. But these are not factual questions. They're questions about how we want to use the word. Now, there is something going on that we loosely refer to as thought, but we don't know much about what it is. And we'll never find out as long as attention is restricted to what's accessible to consciousness. Some of you may know that there are recent experimental results showing that decisions about, say, motor action, like whether to pick this up, that the decision is actually made microseconds before you're aware of making the decision. That's been misinterpreted as an argument about freedom of will. It has nothing to do with freedom of will. What it means that decisions are made in a way that's inaccessible to consciousness. Okay, I don't think that should surprise anyone who's alive and has ever thought about what they do. But it is contrary to a widely held dogma. And I think that dogma has to collapse if we're going to learn about these things.
William Blake used to say, nothing is lost. Nothing is lost. And this seems literally to be true. It seems as though, something once articulated, a statement, the reverberations are unto the last syllable of recorded time. Somehow it's all there. Now, when I said these things approached and spoke in English, I didn't mean to make it sound as mundane as it might sound. Greek religion was characterized by what was called the Logos in the Hellenistic period. And the Logos was an informing voice. And all the great thinkers of Hellenistic times, Plato, Socrates, Xenophon, Thucydides, all of these people were in contact with the Logos. It was the sine qua non of Hellenistic religion. And it was a speaking and informing voice that tells you the right way to live. Well, we don't know what to make of this. And at a certain point in the evolution of the Western mind, judging by the writings of people who were contemporaneous with those times, the Logos fell silent. There was actually a date. Some of you may know the story of the fishermen pulling their nets off the Isle of Rhodes, and they heard a voice from the sky say that great Pan is dead. And this was at the change of the eon, the beginning of the age of Aquarius. It was almost as though there was something in the ancient world that has gone latent, that we can no longer touch or imagine. Gordon Wasson, who discovered with his wife Valentina the mushrooms, told a very interesting story in one of his books about how in Mazatecan, The people who are speakers of Mazatec, when they chant what the mushroom says, they have created a special form for this, which goes like this. Zabuzz, 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 tse. This word tse means says. Zabuzz, says, says. I didn't know this at the time I took mushrooms the second time, and in my head, I heard the mushroom speaking in English, but adding the word says to the end of the sentence. So it was almost like, this thing could speak in Mazatec, it could speak in English, but it always kept its cadence and its structure. The other thing about psilocybin and the DMT thing is that it seems to be a catalyst for glossolalia. This is why I think it must have had something to do with the evolution of language. I mean, when you take psilocybin, you can fall spontaneously into states of glossolalia. Sometimes on DMT, it's almost impossible to control. It just spontaneously comes out. Yeah. Oh, what is glossolalia? Glossolalia, well, here's an example of it, then I'll define it. Sie ding quap mak diki pitech kving hua de molde ruf nubka henget e faps titulch kvem bedigem hegengtecht. It's language-like activity in the absence of meaning. And it's a very interesting thing neurologically, because notice that speech, ordinary speech, is this highly variable stream of data. We are set up to make these small mouth noises. As a public speaker, I'm very aware of the fact that one can speak without tiring almost longer than you can do any other major human motor activity. And, but the glossolalia, such as I just did, it is clearly under the control of rules, but it is not, there is no meaning conventionally conceived of there, but there is syntax. And I think probably that language was invented millennia before meaning, and that you could almost call language toneless singing. And that people used to sit around the campfire and amuse each other by making funny noises. As a kid, I used to do this. And then it was only much, much later that anything approaching linguistic conventionality was imposed on this, and that that's a lower function. The other thing I want to say about this glossolalia thing is, you may say, well, you're just making it up when I do that. But really, the experience I have when I do it is that I stand aside, then this variable data stream comes out through my mouth. Well, now, it has to reflect something about me. It's a statement about my internal situation in that moment. And it's evolving and changing as rapidly as if I were saying, I had a migraine headache last night and I got up about 4 and took an aspirin and, I'm telling you about my situation. But the glossolalia must be speaking to something about my situation, or it wouldn't be possible to do it at all. Not only is something not real unless it can be said, but the contrapositive of that is that once something can be said, it becomes almost too real. It displaces other possibilities. So we're living in a set of constructs, some architectural, some ideological, and they can be very oppressive. How do you get rid of the notion of linear time and space very easily? It's the slow work of consensus. One of the things that I feel I'm doing very consciously in these kinds of meetings is we're trying to launch and replicate memes. You all know this concept? A meme is the smallest unit of an idea, in the same way that a gene is the smallest unit of organism. And so these things, DMT elves, transcendental object at the end of history, so forth. These are memes. And in the same way that genes are copied and spread around, and that fidelity of copying is the key to genetic success, fidelity of meme replication is the key to communication. I mean, if I give a speech on something and then you hear it and then you go out and somebody says, "So what did he say?" and you give a completely cockeyed account of what has been said, well, then the meme has been betrayed. But if you can actually transfer the meme to somebody else's mind, and then they can copy it and pass it on, then the meme, it's almost as though the ideological environment were like a rainforest or a coral reef. Evolution is taking place. Stupid memes, dumb memes have short lifetimes, and they disappear, and memes of great power are able to thrive in many intellectual and ideological niches and to make many marriages of convenience with other memes, and so they are stabilized and passed along. Somehow we have to become hip to the power of language. And instead of just willy-nilly creating linguistic structures sort of ad hoc, we need to begin to consciously engineer our linguistic intent. And then, so far in the 20th century, this has not been a program with a very happy history because only jerks have gotten a hold of it. Nazis and people with narrow social programs. They say, we're not going to call each other Mr. and Mrs. or hey you. Everybody's going to call each other comrade. And then this will create the notion of comradeship, which to a certain degree it does. But, manipulating these things for political ends, I mean, the Jews, it was okay to put Jews in ovens because the official language for talking about Jews was that they were Untermensch, subhuman, not like us, whoever we are. So once the definition had been changed, people said, well, it's okay to mistreat Jews. They're not even really people. And this kind of thinking goes on all the time. It's called stereotyping, and it always is an easier substitute. It's a cheap substitute for clear thinking. David Brown asked me the question, what about life after death? And it was somewhat of a sidebar. The Buddhists at the folk level in India do say you cannot attain enlightenment unless your mother is dead, which is a kind of an odd notion, seeming to imply that she had to precede you into hyperspace. When you die, what you do is you literally, as appears to happen, you dissolve. And where you go is forward and backward into time, not like a gas released into time, but along the tracks and trails of the genetic machinery. In other words, you flow into your children, and you become, let's make a very simple model and say at the moment of death, you become your children and your parents. A few moments later, you become your grandchildren and your grandparents. You're spreading down. It's almost as though the thing which you were, which was this focus of ego and individuality, then it dies. And it's almost as though the mountain begins to slump back into the generalized pool of consciousness and being. That's why I have somewhat less patience maybe than I should have with the idea of channeling and come as you were parties and that sort of thing. Because it seems to me the key to understanding the idea of reincarnation and past lives is that you were everybody. Of course, that's who you are. Here comes everybody. You weren't just that shepherd girl or that Roman emperor or that Greek fellow. You're everybody. And you can find your way into the great genetic telephone system and ring anybody's bell in history, well, then it would be absurd to claim you were that person. That would be as absurd as claiming that anybody you could call on the telephone is who you are. No, it's that we are everyone. And, the great turning object in hyperspace that is the genetic, transdimensional object casts off glinting reflections of this personality, that personality. And astrology has a role to play here and other things. But the bottom line is we are all drawn of the same stuff. I think one of the most profound insights you can have on psychedelics, and I certainly have it, is that we are all interchangeable. Anybody could do my job, and I'm pretty confident I could do almost anybody's job. We define ourselves otherwise, but in watching the rise of my own career, it's a kind of being deputized, chosen for the job. It's just they said, well, he can do it. He has the gift of gab, so give him the credit line. But it could have been anybody. Our uniqueness is real on one level, but on another level, it's fairly illusory. It's sort of a coincidentia positorum. You have to hold these two antithetical things in your mind at once in order to correctly perceive the proper level of ambiguity that's resident in reality. It ain't simple, folks.